the Oakland A's. Earlier today, Reggie Jackson talked to the Oakland A's right fielder.
The kind of season that people expect.
The original recipe, oh what a taste. Kentucky Fried Chicken. We do chicken right.
Channel 5 reminds you to turn your clocks back tonight. The following is an Election 88 special presentation. Race for the Senate, the Kennedy-Malone debate, sponsored by WCVB-TV and the Massachusetts League of Women Voters. Reporting live from our studios, News Center 5's Jay Shadler.
Good evening. On behalf of the Massachusetts League of Women Voters and WCVB-TV, I would like to welcome you to this first and only televised debate between the two major party candidates running for the United States Senate from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. First, Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy and his Republican challenger, Joseph Malone. Joining us here in the studio as members of our panel tonight are News Center 5 political reporters Martha Bradley and Janet Wu. Welcome also to all of you watching on Channel 5 here in Boston and WGGB-TV in Springfield, and also all of those who you are listening who are on radio stations who are simulcasting this broadcast tonight all across the state. I will be explaining the format for tonight's debate in just a moment, but we begin with words of introduction from Arlene Stam, who is president of the League of Women Voters here in Massachusetts. Arlene?
Thank you, Jay, and good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to this U.S. senatorial debate on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. This debate is between Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat, and Joseph Malone, Republican. At a time when the presidential candidates and the political parties have been criticized for orchestrating debates which are no more than 30-second sound bites, it is commendable that Edward Kennedy and Joseph Malone have agreed to a format that allows for a full discussion of the important public policy issues. The League believes in a democracy where elections belong to the voter and not to the candidate. The League wishes to acknowledge our gratitude to our co-sponsor, WCVB-TV Channel 5, and they and the League wish to remind you that democracy is not a spectator sport. Remember, on November 8th, vote. And now back to our moderator, Jay Shadler.
Thank you, Arlene. Now the format for tonight's debate. By prior agreement, candidates will answer questions from three different categories: social policy, foreign policy and defense, and also the economy. During a regular rotation, each candidate will be asked a question and then be given approximately a minute and a half to deliver his answer. The other candidate will then have a similar amount of time to deliver his rebuttal. As many of you know, the League withdrew its support from the final presidential debate this year, objecting to the highly controlled format, which allowed no free exchange between the candidates. We are therefore pleased to announce that at the end of each answer period tonight, the candidates will have time to challenge each other. Members of the panel will also, of course, be allowed to have a follow-up question and ask for clarifications. At the end of the debate, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. And now, gentlemen, let's begin. Senator Kennedy, by a coin toss, you get the first question. This past week, Senator, a jury of Massachusetts residents found Daniel LaPlante guilty of what a number of police investigators described as the most cold-blooded, heinous crime that they had ever seen: the murder of a pregnant mother and her 2 children. The sentencing judge suggested that if only the option were available to him, the death penalty would be his recommendation. And if anyone deserves the death penalty, said the prosecutor, it is Daniel LaPlante. Senator, my question to you is this: do you believe that some men and women are inherently evil and beyond rehabilitation? And should Daniel LaPlante be executed?
Well, first of all, I'm opposed to the death penalty. It is a matter of principle. But over the time that I've been in the United States Senate, I have supported strong law enforcement and criminal justice measures. I have supported the violent juvenile offender legislation that said that repeated juvenile offenders should be treated as adults and not as juveniles. More than half of the crimes that are committed by violent juveniles. I initiated the bail reform legislation that permits judges to retain individuals in incarceration prior to trial if a judge makes the determination that they are dangerous to the community. That can make a difference in terms of violent juvenile and older offenders. I was also the author of the sentencing reform in the Senate and passed the House of Representatives. It's now law. Basically, the underlying thought about that is if an individual commits a crime, an individual will do time. I welcome the fact that only yesterday I was supported by the leading law enforcement officials of Massachusetts. And finally, I would say in the recent legislation that passed the United States Senate on the omnibus drug bill, a key element of that was the criminal justice provisions. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I insisted that the primary aspect of that legislation was going to give local law enforcement the tools to be able to do the kind of tough and difficult work that they have to do to deal with drug pushers.
Mr. Malone, rebuttal?
First of all, I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for pulling this debate together. And particularly, I'd like to thank Barbara Friedman for her shuttle diplomacy in bringing this about. I'd also like to thank all those people throughout Massachusetts who have shown my wife Linda and myself kindness throughout these last 7 months. With regard to this issue of the death penalty, we see in America a police officer murdered every 57 hours. Here in Boston, we're seeing murders take place far more often than we'd like to see them take place. And I think the only way that society can send a message to those murderers who are out on the streets, many of them drug kingpins, is to let them know once and for all that if they commit murder, they're going to pay that price with their life. And so I support the death penalty, and I think it's extremely important that that message be sent out to every single person out there who even thinks about taking another person's life.
As we mentioned at the top of the show, we have some free time.
Make a comment. Our inner cities are free fire zones. When these drug pushers are out on the street, they're not thinking about the death penalty. They're thinking about how they make a deal. That's the fact of the matter. And when people talk about this as a matter of ending the problem of the proliferation of drugs, it really misses what most law enforcement officials will tell you. That what is happening out there is that they're a free fire zone, and they're well equipped, and they're talented individuals. Secondly, and then I'd be glad to yield. In the hearings that we had in the Senate Judiciary Committee, by those involved in the international aspects of drug trafficking, and that's where most of the kingpins are involved, they told us that you pass a death penalty and you will not extradite a key drug dealer in any of the countries around the world because those countries don't have the death penalty, and they will not extradite them to a country that do. Now, if we're going to try and deal with those serious drug pushers and peddlers and drug kingpins, we have to understand what the nature is of this problem and how we're going to best be able to extradite them to bring them to justice here in the United States.
Senator, you're down in Washington more than you're here. Talk to people out in the streets here today. They're fed up with criminals being handled with kid gloves, or they're fed up with people being sent out on weekend furloughs. It's about time we send a message to murderers in this country that they are going to pay if they commit murder. And I know a young man who was shot, a police officer in East Boston. His partner was murdered. I think it's a disgrace that we send law enforcement agents out there to defend this society without allowing them to at least have a death penalty for those people who attempt to take their lives. And I think that liberals in this country have time and time again turned around and said, how are we going to worry about the criminal here? It's about time that we start worrying about the victim.
Mr. Malone, I don't need a lesson from anyone about violence and what violence can do to a family.
Senator Kennedy, I would say this, that it's time that working men and women have it their way. In this country, working men and women want the death penalty to be instituted. And I think it ought to be instituted. And I think you're out of step. I think you're out of step here.
Very, very quickly, do either of you believe that prison rehabilitates a man or a woman?
I think in some cases it absolutely does. but we ought to let those people who are about to commit murder know that that is not one crime that we're looking to rehabilitate them for.
Senator, in 10 or 15 seconds, does prison rehabilitate, man?
It can. It's not doing the job today.
All right. We'll move on. We continue in the category of social policy, and our next question is directed to Mr. Malone from Martha Bradley.
Mr. Malone, you and George Bush share a similar position on abortion. That is, you favor it only in the case of rape or incest. If, in fact, you believe that abortion is the killing of an innocent human being, why is it not murder to abort a child conceived in that way?
First of all, this is an issue that I think we all struggle with, and we all look to come up with that answer that is the black and white answer, and it simply isn't there. There are 1.6 million abortions in America each year now, and there is no contradiction there in terms of if it's a life, then therefore why not also have abortions illegal for rape, incest, or the mother's life being at stake. The important thing here is that we stop this abortion
No, I'd like you to address that
on.
particularly,
I
if you
will tell you.
If you will. You see no contradiction in that. If it's an innocent human being, then why taking the life, as you believe, of a child conceived in rape or incest? What's the difference there?
Because
I don't
there
see
are
what you're saying.
exceptions. And when we send somebody out to fight in a war, we don't say to that person it's fine to go out and murder. But I think the larger issue here is this, that Senator Kennedy has consistently supported federal funding of abortions, and I think that's absolutely wrong. There are people in this country, and I'm a Catholic, and there are a lot of other Catholics, who believe that abortion is wrong, and yet Ted Kennedy, through his taxing policies, is essentially saying you're going to pay for abortions despite the fact that you think abortion is taking the life.
Mr. Malone, I'm sorry, one more time.
Sure.
What is the difference there? I know it's a difficult decision, but is there a difference? And certainly it would be traumatic for any woman who had to carry a child conceived that way. But isn't the punishment much greater for the child that you believe?
No, I mean, you're suggesting here, Martha, that every single law that we make ought to be a black and white situation.
I'm not suggesting it. I just want to know how you came to your decision.
I came to my decision because it isn't a complete loaf here, but it's 9/10. It's a way of saying we're going to do away with abortions, but yet make those exceptions. And it's an exception that's being made, and that always occurs in our society. And I didn't, frankly, expect to come here tonight, Martha, and debate you. I thought I was going to be debating Senator Kennedy, but...
Well,
that's why it's a free debate, free and open debate. That's what we wanted here tonight.
Then let's continue with that process. Sure. Senator Kennedy?
Well, my position is clear, and that is that this is an extremely difficult decision for any person to make, for any woman to make. I don't think any woman makes it lightly, and I believe that an individual ought to be able to make that decision within their conscience, in consultation with their religious advisor. And I don't believe that the federal government ought to be involved in it. The only other question is a matter of health policy in terms of any of the federal funding. But that is my belief on the whole basic and fundamental question of the pro-choice issue.
May I? Senator, if you don't think the federal government ought to be involved in it, why should the federal government take our tax dollars, working men and women's tax dollars, and say we're going to spend those tax dollars on abortions? Don't you think that that's wrong?
Well, do you think that's what we do?
Yeah, I do.
Well, you're not right.
I think that's what you vote for.
You're not right.
Senator, I think that's what you vote for.
The basic policy now is in terms of the rape.
Have you voted for that, or have
have
you voted for
if
federal
I could,
funding? Please, I'm asking.
Yes. The current law now prohibits any kind of federal funding, with the rare exceptions, limited to about 1,000 a year. I have voted in the cases where the medical necessity requires that kind of a medical procedure, and I vote for that. I do not exclude that from the range of different medical procedures which that situation takes place. That has been my position. I don't think we ought to separate that out.
I just want to make it clear that you voted for federal funding of abortions.
That is correct in those circumstances which require medical necessity. We know what happens in this country, and where those that have wealth are able to afford those particular procedures and are able to buy those particular procedures, and by and large, what we're talking about are individuals who are the poorest in our society who would not be able to do that.
Senator,
the current law is that that is not available. It is true that I would vote to ensure that the poorest individuals in our society should not be discriminated against in that way from those that are able to have a few dollars and be able to afford
Earlier, Senator, you said don't lecture you. I hope you won't lecture me on the wealthy, because I don't think that's the case here.
All right, let's end the lecture and continue the debate. Third question from Janet Wu is directed at Senator Kennedy.
Senator, a week from Tuesday, the voters are going to be going to the polls not only to pick a president and a senator, but also to make some important decisions on issues, and they will come in the form of ballot questions. One of the most controversial ones that is being debated right now is question number 4. And question number 4 would effectively shut down both nuclear power plants here in Massachusetts, and surprisingly, a good number of critics of nuclear power are opposing this question. Where do you stand on it? Why? And how much would it cost ratepayers if it did pass?
I'm opposed to nuclear power. I'll vote no on question 4. Primarily the way that it is phrased, it would terminate in a very abrupt period of time. I think there's serious questions whether that would be able to be possible, number one. And secondly, it's uncertain as to who would bear the burden and the liability if that was to be closed. Is that going to be a burden that's going to fall on the taxpayers, or is that going to be a burden that's going to fall on the investors? I think a strong case can say that that would fall on the taxpayers. That would be in excess of $1 billion. I don't believe that that's right. I think if you're going to have that kind of a termination, then the burden ought to fall on the speculators and the investors and not the taxpayers of Massachusetts. So although I'm strongly opposed to nuclear power, I will vote no for those reasons.
In a separate but similar situation, as far as Pilgrim is concerned, there is a great deal of debate going on right now as to whether Pilgrim should be reopened. Do you think Pilgrim should be allowed to reopen, and under what circumstances?
No, I don't. I testified before the Nuclear Regulatory Agency 10 days ago in Washington on that. I don't think Pilgrim was found to be the most unsafe plant in America at the time that it was closed. They've made some progress in terms of safety, but they haven't met the prime issue about evacuation. And anybody that knows that region of our state knows that there is virtually impossible to have the kind of evacuation program that FEMA has outlined, and which the Nuclear Regulatory Agency has overruled in the cases of Seabrook, for example, in a way which I think is blatantly flagrant and illegal. And I don't think that it should be opened.
All right, Senator. Let me remind both of the reporters as well as the candidates, at least during the immediate first minute 30 response time and the initial question, will allow the candidates to give their answers before
That was directed at me, right?
Oh, actually, both of you. All right, you may have a rebuttal here, Mr. Malone.
Sure, I'm voting no on question 4, and I support nuclear power. Now, I also realize that it's extremely important that we make sure that every single safety precaution can be taken. And as a United States Senator, I would make sure that I went out to that particular area and made sure that I looked at the evacuation plan, talked to the people in that area, and found out their concerns before I let the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or anybody else go ahead with their plans. In addition to that, I think we also have to understand that we need power in this region, and we're seeing brownouts in the summer, and we're seeing costs going up with regard to energy. So nuclear power is a source of energy that can be used safely and somewhat inexpensively. So I think we ought to move in that direction.
All right, Mr. Malone, we have, our producers tell us that we have a little additional time, so we're going to continue with one additional question in the social policy area. It's directed to you, Mr. Malone. Over the course of the next administration, it is almost certain that profound changes will take place in the composition of the Supreme Court. The Senate will likely give its advice and consent on a number of Supreme Court nominees. In hopes of illuminating your own preferences in this regard, I would ask you to please tell us which current Supreme Court justice most closely resembles your own legal and social philosophy, and please give an example of an opinion that that justice has written with which you agree.
I would say that, first of all, the recent appointees have been excellent. And I also want to point out that during the course of the Bork hearings, I think Senator Kennedy was out of line. He stepped forward, and he essentially was playing President of the United States. He ran for president in 1980 and was rejected. It was Ronald Reagan's opportunity to appoint the person to the Supreme Court that he wanted to appoint, assuming that the nomination was approved. And I think the kind of kangaroo court that took place during those hearings were absolutely wrong. Now, in addition to that, I would say that the recent appointees by Ronald Reagan have been excellent.
Senator, would you like to
Well,
pick that
of
up?
course, the advice and consent function requires that the Senate of the United States not be a rubber stamp. And I know that Mr. Malone had supported the nominee, Mr. Bork. I felt strongly that he was selected for ideological reasons, and I welcome the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Senate, Republicans and Democrats alike, rejected it. I would say that the justices I admire the most would be Justice Brennan. I think he has been an outstanding tower and powerful intellect. I think Thurgood Marshall has been one of the real leaders, not only before he went to the court, but on the court. I think Justice Blackmun as well. I think that the case that comes to mind probably is their dissent in the recent Reynolds case. But those are three individuals who I think really have demonstrated over any recent period of time the kind of commitment to constitutional rights and liberties which I think really are in the mainstream of constitutional.
May I just add one other thing? Senator,
Very
you
quickly,
once said that if strong political views would disqualify people from serving on the bench, then every single United States senator would be disqualified from serving on the bench. So I think your steps that you took during the process that I referred to were wrong for reasons other than Judge Bork's ideology. I think there was
Mr.
a
Malone?
case here where you just simply wanted to grandstand on that particular issue.
Mr. Malone, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. We move now to the area of foreign policy, and by prior format, the question is directed to Mr. Malone, and it begins like this. 4 times in just the past 8 years during the Reagan administration, U.S. military actions in Lebanon, Grenada, Libya, and most recently in the Persian Gulf have touched off a heated debate among senators as to whether the War Powers Act should be exercised. Since, if elected, you may be called upon to interpret that act, I ask you tonight to briefly explain, first of all, what the War Powers Act is, and tell us if you would have invoked it during any of those 4 military operations.
First of all, in traveling throughout this state, I sense that there's a pride now in America that didn't exist back in the late 1970s. Those were the days when Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy and other liberals were running the foreign policy in this country. And you look at the difference that we now see here, where we have democracies growing in places like Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru. There are good things occurring now with regard to our foreign policy, unlike what was going on in the late 1970s. With regard to the War Powers Act, I think it's micromanagement on behalf of the Congress. And I think we've run into a lot of problems as a result of that micromanagement. It takes away any flexibility for the President of the United States. And I think that's harmful. I know that it was put into effect with all the best intentions at a time when presidents seemed to be out of control a bit. But I don't think it is really a workable measure at this time.
Senator?
Well, the War Powers Act was basically put into effect so that if this country was going to commit American servicemen, it was going to do so with the support of the American people. That we were not going to be in a situation where an individual president was going to be able to go it alone. And so the provisions were written into the War Powers Act that if the lives of American servicemen were going to be threatened, that there was going to be the report to the Congress, a period of 60 days available to the president to be able to for a reconfirmation of that action by the Congress, or otherwise those troops would have to be withdrawn. It was basically just saying, look, if you're going to experience the loss of American lives, you better have the country behind it. I support it completely. Now, in the areas that you mentioned, clearly Lebanon, yes, given the kind of conflict that existed in that. I would say in Grenada, probably not. The issue in Grenada was whether the lives of Americans was really being threatened at that time. We had a number of students that were located in Grenada, and I think it's difficult to second-guess the United States president when he is going into the saving of the lives. You can look at the situation later and say, well, he shouldn't have done it. It was done for political purpose. But I didn't second-guess the president on that with regard to the American lives in Grenada. Clearly on the Persian Gulf, we should have. We've suffered the loss of lives there. I think the tragedy in the Persian Gulf was that we didn't bring our allies in. You know, there are many individuals who just want to see America go it alone at the risk of American lives and for us American taxpayers to pick up the tariff. And that was certainly true in the times up in the Persian Gulf.
Mr. Malone, I'd like you to respond to this, going back to the initial question. Those 4 instances of military action, Lebanon, Grenada, Libya, and the Persian Gulf, you didn't specifically answer whether or not you would have invoked that.
In any one of those areas, the War Powers Act would have been difficult to invoke because it ties the hands of the president.
Even in Lebanon, where Americans were under fire, 291 Marines were killed.
That's correct.
I would think that if you ask most Americans on the street if that was a war zone, they would say, yes, indeed, that's a war zone.
But we're talking about what's practical here. And the problem there would have been that the President of the United States would have been looked upon by Congress, and our adversaries in Lebanon would have been saying, is Congress going to pull the plug on this, or is not Congress going to pull the plug on this? That's the problem there, where it provides an incentive for our adversaries to try to put enough leverage against a president so it causes the Congress to pull the plug on the president.
If not Lebanon, can you pose a hypothetical situation where you would invoke it then?
Sure. I mean, if we get into a situation, which God help us we don't, where there's a full-fledged military action that is taking place, then absolutely. But not in a situation where a president has to deal with terrorism or where a president has to deal on a short-term basis. And the senator was critical of the president with regard to the Persian Gulf mission, and I think it's worked out very well. The president also criticized, the senator also criticized the president with regard to Grenada.
Senator, like to
well,
respond?
first of all, I supported the incident for Grenada for the very reason I outlined earlier. We're not talking about the limited examples of terrorism. The War Powers Act excludes its application and the immediacy for the protection of American kind of lives. But what it basically does is say, look, if you're going to enter a war, the type of situation, if you had an all-out war, you wouldn't need a War Powers Act because the country, you'd pass it in about 5 seconds in the Congress, the Senate of the United States. The real question is, in the kind of limited situations that we're going to be facing in the world, not across the Europe or Korea or the strategic exchanges, but in those limited war situations, doesn't it make sense before we are going to have the commitment of American lives, whether we're talking about Central America or other parts of the world, that you're going to have an America that's going to be united? And that was the essence, the concept of the War Powers Act. And that's why I believe it's supported. Let me just say, I believe so strongly on that we had votes in the United States Congress that said I will not send troops there unless we're going to come back to the Congress to be able to get approval for it. And the majority of the Republicans in the Senate opposed that. I don't want to send sons from Massachusetts down to Central America at the whim of an individual president. Now that may be satisfactory to some, but I would think that people here in Massachusetts, before they are going to have their sons go to Central America or to go to these various places around the world, would want to make sure that there is going to be some ability to debate it, and they're going to be able to express some views about it.
Mr. Malone.
Now, this is an important
point.
difference, which I have with Mr. Malone.
And I agree. We have a difference. It's a micromanagement by Congress of foreign policy, and I think that's dangerous. I think we have to allow the president, in instances like the ones you cited, to have enough independence to follow out or carry out the duties of the president.
Well, let me ask you a question. Would you let the president send troops down then into Nicaragua?
Of course I wouldn't, Senator. And the important thing with regard to Nicaragua is that we make sure that the pressure is kept on Daniel Ortega. Time and time again, he has broken his word with the international community. And even Mr. Arias is now becoming upset with Ortega because of the way in which he has conducted himself. And I think it's naive on your part, Senator, to just conclude that Ortega is going to be a nice fellow and he's going to conduct himself in the right manner. It's absolutely wrong. 10 times the Soviet has pumped in 10 times the humanitarian aid and 8 times the military aid down to Nicaragua that the U.S. has sent in. And I think there's a clear-cut case here of Mr. Ortega and the Sandinistas building up an unprecedented army down there. And for you to simply turn your back on a situation in Central America is absolutely wrong. You were ready to do that with regard to El Salvador as well, and now we have a growing democracy down there. Look at what's going on in the world now, Senator. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, El Salvador, Grenada. That didn't happen as a result of some sort of accident. That didn't happen by us saying we're going to be benevolent to the rest of the countries of the world and simply sit back. We took a leadership role. And you wanted to have a nuclear freeze back in 1981, which now everybody looks at and says that would have been a joke. That would have destroyed any sort of leverage we had over the Soviet Union in terms of bringing about an INF treaty. Have you ever reconsidered, Senator, and said you were wrong about a nuclear freeze that would have locked America in where it was?
No, I thought we were talking about the War Powers Act, and I was glad that we had some
you
agreement.
Brought up you brought up Nicaragua, Senator. That's where it came from.
Well, the point that we were discussing about is the commitment of American troops and under what circumstances, I think, was the other kind of issue.
But as long as we're on that nuclear freeze issue, you may as well answer it. I'm sure
I'd be glad to.
If you'd like to respond, we have a few moments.
Track in the time. The nuclear freeze movement started here in Massachusetts and was one of the most important grassroots movements that took place across this country. I was glad to be a prime sponsor with Mark Hatfield of that movement in the United States Senate. You have to think back a little bit in time. In the little bit in time, in the period of the nuclear freeze at the time of the early 1980s, we had a president that was talking about winning a nuclear war, going to war and winning it. That was the atmosphere and the climate in which the nuclear freeze began. And what the nuclear freeze program started, it said, look, if you can kill every man, woman, and child 10 times over, does it really make sense to build more nuclear weapons? This administration made the decision to move ahead on that. The nuclear freeze movement, I believe, to this day, was the movement that brought Ronald Reagan to the negotiating table. And I believe it very deeply, and I think history will demonstrate that.
All right, Senator,
I
thank you
think
very
that's
much.
wrong, Senator, and I think the reason why we got an INF treaty is because Ronald Reagan had the foresight to realize that we could actually cut nuclear arms as opposed to
Mr. Malone.
freezing at a disadvantage.
Mr. Malone, we do have time for one additional foreign policy question, and that is from Martha Bradley, directed to Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, let's stay on this for a moment.
Sure.
We do have an INF treaty. It was negotiated by Ronald Reagan. President Reagan has always advocated peace through strength. I know it's difficult to argue with success, but do you disagree with anything he did in those negotiations?
Sure. First of all, I support an INF agreement. I think we ought to look at what it's achieved. It's a 4% reduction. In Europe, we have actually built more weapons than we've destroyed, the United States and the Soviet Union, since that has actually been signed. I support peace through strength where the president is correct, but not in the areas of military confrontation in Central America. And I also think that peace through strength means not only military capability, it means economic capability. And peace through strength also means in using our economic capability to try and bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. It also means the power of our ideals and representing that in many different parts of the world. And we ought to be exercising those kind of qualities as well. Supporting peace through strength where it is correct, and separating myself from peace through strength when it just becomes a slogan. And that is something that I've tried to follow in the United States Senate. We have an arms policy in Central America, but we basically undermined the Escapula agreements, the RS agreements, and I think we ought to try peace before we try the military solution.
Mr. Malone,
and in that we've had differences with the
rebuttal on that, Mr. Malone?
Once again, I'd just like to say that in speaking with people throughout this state, there's a new sense of pride about America in terms of our foreign policy. This country was in shambles with regard to foreign policy in the late 70s, and Ronald Reagan got in there and he said, I'm going to do what's best for America and what's best for the free world by making America strong again. And Senator Kennedy has consistently voted against a strong America. And we have a fundamental difference in opinion here. And I think working men and women from throughout this state and throughout this nation want a government down in Washington that's going to make sure that we can look the Soviets in the eye at the bargaining table and say to them, we're strong, and if you want to negotiate, that's great, let's negotiate. But don't think you're going to get the upper hand on us. And that's what would have occurred with Senator Kennedy's freeze. It would have been an absolute disaster for the free world. And those are the kind of mistakes that we can't afford to make. Those are the kind of mistakes that you simply don't say because a president said something, according to Senator Kennedy, that we're going to implement that kind of a foreign policy maneuver. That would have been a terrible situation for this nation if we ever moved ahead with a unilateral nuclear freeze.
Well,
If I can interject for just a moment, please, so sure. You're not the only one mad at me here. Do you believe we would have had an INF agreement if the Pershing and cruise missiles hadn't been deployed in Europe?
Yes, I do, but I don't question whether the argument could be made because they're there. It had some kind of a factor in terms of the negotiation. But beyond that, no one is suggesting a unilateral nuclear freeze. That isn't what the freeze. It was
Senator,
a mutual.
you had several different positions, one of which was unilateral.
Sure, if I can just want to even in the debate in the Senate, you don't interrupt and we get a chance just to talk.
It's more like a British Parliament here.
Yeah,
and Mr. Malone will come back to you very shortly, please.
I never advocate a unilateral freeze. It was mutual, number one. Secondly, I have opposed gold-plated weapon systems. There are some that suggest that we ought to take any gold-plated weapon system that comes down the pike and thereby demonstrating how tough we are. And thereby, there are those that support the administration's hundreds of billions of dollars Star Wars program. I do not. I don't think it enhances our security, nor do I think it is something that can be functioned, nor do I with regard to a B-1 bomber. So when individuals talk about who is really for strength, I think we have to understand that strength, it isn't the amount of money you spend, it is what you buy with the money.
Senator, let's move back here. We are dealing with sort of rough approximations of time, but we'd like to give Mr. Malone a little additional time here. Mr. Malone, any further response on that particular issue?
I would just say you have to look at the overall results of a foreign policy in terms of an administration's accomplishments.
Let's go back to Martha's question.
Sure.
Is there anything that you would disagree with in terms of Ronald Reagan's military policy over the course of the last 8 years?
Well, she mentioned
actually, I mentioned only the
with
Soviet
regard to the
Union.
INF.
All right, well, let's broaden it and say anything that Ronald Reagan has done in the era of military policy over the course of the last 8 years, would you say you object to, and what is it specifically?
Let me say this, that the way in which to grade a foreign policy of an administration is by looking at what has occurred over that term, whether it be a 4-year term or an 8-year term. And Ronald Reagan gets, if not an A-minus, at the very least a B+. Conversely, the liberals of the late 70s probably deserve an F for what they did to the free world. They consistently walked away. They cut and ran. Ronald Reagan has shown a willingness to allow America to be involved, be strong, but yet bring about good results as a result of our involvement. The Persian Gulf situation was a prime example. Afghanistan was another prime example. We're seeing results in Angola. We saw results in El Salvador. And Senator Kennedy has consistently gone the other way, where he has suggested that we ought to cut and run.
All right. We move now on to the area.
Can we get just a brief comment?
You've got 30 seconds or so?
The only, I will take a responsibility for a lot of different things, but not for the administration of the late 70s, Mr. Carter's administration, which I ran against, both in terms of economic and foreign policy, but we won't get into that. You know, a key area that we haven't brought up, and this administration hasn't addressed, and that is in burden sharing. We're talking about the burden on the average taxpayer, and of course we'll hopefully be able to get into why Mr. Malone wants to evidently increase that with a reduction on the capital gains tax.
You yourself said brief now, Senator.
Okay, but the fact is, why haven't we gotten our allies to pick up more of the burden in defense? Why hasn't this administration been able to get both the Western Europeans and the Japanese to pick up some of the burden on this? I think it's scandalous that they haven't done it. They have been burdening the American taxpayer alone for this.
Would you be
and
in
that,
favor
I think,
of that,
has
Mr. Malone?
been unfortunate.
Absolutely, but what the Senator didn't point out is that people like Gene Kirkpatrick and the Reagan administration pushed to have burden sharing. And it's got to happen over a 12-year period, and it will. Already Japan is now protecting its sea lanes for 1,000 miles. And that's an indication that we are getting our allies to pick up more of the tab. And I agree 100% that that ought to occur. The days of America picking up the tab for keeping the free world free should be over.
Picking up the tab is a perfect transition into general questions about the economy, and we begin that with a question to Mr. Malone from Janet Wu.
Mr. Malone, you say you support the concept of a balanced budget amendment, and this would mean not only deep cuts in the budget, but it would also mean finding new revenue sources. And you've said that there is a great deal of waste and fat in the budget. Can you please name 3 specific examples of waste, the amount of money it would free up if it was cut from the budget? And then I would like you to name 3 new taxes, or if you prefer the euphemism, revenue sources that you would be willing to support.
Talk to people out there, and they're all concerned about the fact that they're getting hit with higher and higher taxes, more and more regulations, more and more bureaucracy, more and more government spending. I just want to tell you a story about a woman in Norwood who owns a restaurant, and she built that restaurant through a lot of hard work. And she recently sent a letter to Senator Kennedy saying, "Senator, your policies jeopardize my very livelihood. And I worked for you once in your campaign, but now I realize that you've left the working man and woman of this state." The U.S. Chamber of Commerce rates Senator Kennedy at the lowest level among United States senators. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the group that represents small business in this country. Small business, the goose that lays the golden eggs, according to Paul Tsongas, the goose that we have to keep alive. As far as how we are going to get this deficit under control, and that is the root of this question here, we need to keep spending under control at the rate of inflation at the federal level. That doesn't mean we have to slash programs. That means we have to show fiscal restraint. And currently, Senator Kennedy has billions and billions of dollars worth of new programs on the table that if they were implemented, it would send a message to our financial markets that we're not serious about balancing this budget. Interest rates would go up again like they did in the late 1970s, and working men and women would end up bearing the burden of that, end up taking on the pain of those kind of policies that are absolutely irresponsible.
Senator, rebuttal.
Well, I didn't hear the 3 that was asked for, but
if we're talking about raising taxes, I don't.
Senator's rebuttal time, please.
First of all, we have to move to a balanced budget. I've supported the Graham-Rudman proposal that'll move us to a balanced budget by 1993. I supported a line item veto. I'd give that to whoever is president so that they can identify those various programs that they want to identify for elimination. I think those are 2 extremely important steps that can be taken. I think there are places and there can be, and there has been some reduction in terms of spending. I think there can be some revenue enhancement. I'm opposed to any changes in the individual taxes. I'm opposed to any changes in the corporate taxes. Those were put in place in 1986. I think there are some areas in where we both can raise revenues without touching individuals and where we can also reduce expenditures. I think we ought to increase our taxes on foreign investment. Foreign investors are investing in this country. They're getting off relatively free in terms of the taxes they're paying. I think the subsidies that we're providing for large corporate farmers is scandalous. We've gone from $5 billion to $25 billion over the period of the last 8 years in additional expenditures. And we've got billions of dollars now that are going to the corporate farmers, not the family farmers. The 3 Martini luncheon, businessman's luncheon, that the Chamber is always so interested in defending. I think we could save billions of dollars in those areas. In terms of the expenditures, cutting programs, I think we're spending billions of dollars in subsidizing the nuclear power industry. That ought to be altered and changed. And I think we can put a cap on the student interest on the student loans of the interest that is being paid on that to the banks. And we can be more effective in covering some of those loans.
Mr. Malone, would you like to respond both to
billions of dollars,
both to the senator as well as Janet's original question?
Sure. First of all, the senator has voted for things like $8 million for a religious school in France. He has voted for increased price supports for farmers. What that means is that we end up sending $34 billion to farmers who in many cases are wealthy. It's not always the family farmers. In some cases, it's farmers who are making in the six figures. And the reason why that happens is because senators like Senator Kennedy down in Washington swap favors, and they say, if you push through my bill, I'll push through your bill. And who ends up picking up the tab but us, the working men and women? And that's got to stop. We've got to bring this budget around so that we have a 4.5% annual increase and no more. And Senator Kennedy, by everyone's measure, has been the biggest spender of them all. And he's not spending his money, he's spending our money.
You say, under your concept of how you would balance the budget, are you therefore implying that there should be no new programs for either education, acid rain, or a multitude of other things that you've campaigned on? There will be no new programs at all in order to balance the budget?
But that when we add a new program, that we need to then make some cutbacks or slowing down in the increase of spending in other areas, so that we actually end up with only 4.5% in increased spending on an annual basis.
What are some of those areas that you would cut back in?
Well, first of all, the price supports that I just mentioned, $34 billion. That's outrageous. And the president does need a line item veto because Senator Kennedy and others have consistently thrown things into big continuing resolutions, as he did with the Boston Herald. Think about that for a second. Throwing that in, trying to shut down the Boston Herald, where 600 jobs were at stake. That was unbelievable, that a United States Senator from Massachusetts could try to shut down the second largest newspaper in his own home state. That's irresponsible. But getting back to the spending end of it, you take that budget and you go through it just like that small business person does or that homeowner does, who says, I have this many dollars and I have this many things on my list. Mario Cuomo once said about Senator Kennedy, he's a different type of liberal than I am because he never had to worry about stretching a dollar at the end of the month. Cuomo said, I understand what it's like to have this many things that you want, but only this many dollars that you can spend. Cuomo said, Ted Kennedy is a lot like Nelson Rockefeller in that regard.
All right, Mr. Malone and Senator Kennedy, we have one additional question.
Do we have a little chance you get?
Well, perhaps you can include in the response.
Very briefly, you know, listening to the discussion, talking about working men and women, I'm reminded, in looking at history, that the two presidents that did the most working men and women were Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. And they didn't come what would be conceived to be from working men and women. It isn't where you come from, it's where you stand. And I welcome the fact that I've had the support of working men and women, not only out in the plants and factories, but also as the chairman of the Human Resource and Labor Committee.
All right, perhaps, Senator, you can continue on that thought with this additional question and the last question in the area of economics. When it comes to the deficit, which is what we've been chatting about here, the Congress, as you well know, Senator, blames the president for bloated Pentagon budgets. And then the president returns that favor, accusing the Congress of pork barrel politics. In the meantime, the deficit continues to loom. My question to you is this, a two-part question. In 26 years in the Senate, would you admit to ever having fallen victim to the temptation of the pork barrel? And secondly, would you please name one non-military program that you would now recommend be cut from next year's budget?
Sure. I'm a great believer in the use of satellite technology in the areas of education. We had a good program called the MSET program that was developed at the University of Massachusetts. We passed that, sent it over to the House of Representatives. It was a part of what they call the Taft authorization legislation. We passed it unanimously, Republicans and Democrats. It got over to the House, they said no, it's going to be pork for Massachusetts. That's my type of pork. Education, doing something that can be in the front line of education using new technologies. That's happened only in the last couple of weeks. And the other part of your question?
The other part of the question concerned whether or not you would specifically cut a program, in a non-military program, next year's budget.
Yeah, on the non-military budget for next year, I mentioned that my votes against the impacted aid, the revenue section, and the CETA. I would cut back on the in the areas of education, guaranteed student loan programs. I'd recover the money that is also in the Outset Now and put on some ceilings in terms of the student loan. But let me point out just finally, we've squeezed these programs to the bone. And I don't want to possibly leave the impression that in areas of health and in education and care for the elderly, that I think there are many programs out there to cut, because I don't believe it. And I don't want the people of Massachusetts to think that in basic research, AIDS research, in these areas here, in the fight against drugs, that we're going to be able to battle these in the cheap, because that's going to be a false impression.
Mr. Malone responds.
With regard to helping senior citizens, helping disabled people, I will be the strongest proponent of those programs as a United States Senator. But Senator Kennedy raised an issue here. He mentioned the Taft education bill. That bill started out as a $750,000 bill. Then the pork started to be added to it, and Senator Kennedy added a $10 million additional price tag to that bill. It ended up going from $750,000 to $60 million. Incredible. That's what's wrong with Congress today. And who's picking up the tab for that? Working men and women. And Senator, you can say that, you know, it's where you stand or whatever you had to say about that, but nevertheless, people are growing tired about having to spend more and more of their hard-earned dollars having to send them down to Washington so that we can create more bureaucracy with more and more regulations the way the senator likes to do it. We've seen it right here in Massachusetts. This government has gone out of control with 10,000 new employees, 6,000 new consultants, and we're paying for it. Working men and women are paying for it, who are trying to educate their children, who are trying to pay their mortgage, who are trying to put aside a little something for their future. And as somebody who wants to be a United States Senator for working men and women, I say enough is enough. It's time to change that attitude.
We have a brief amount of time for exchange, Senator.
Well, that is why I'm so surprised that Mr. Malone supports a capital gains tax. That capital gains tax will cost $6 to $8 billion loss to the internal revenue a year. We're talking, on the one hand, what I am glad to pin on me as pork if it's education. Anytime, if you just wait, Mr. Malone, $6 to $8 billion a year, according to CBO. We repealed the capital gains tax in 1986 as part of the tax reform bill. President Reagan signed it. Now, Mr. Bush and Mr. Malone want to put that traditional old Republican tax cut back in, that trickle down, capital gains. That will average $30,000 to every individual over $200,000.
Mr. Malone?
So all those people who are watching that program, this is the person. And for all those working men and women that Mr. Malone wants to defend, I hope you can explain that.
Edgewise or otherwise, Mr. Malone?
I sure can. Once again, I think Senator Kennedy has found another tax that he would hate to see cut. In 1981, he opposed the president's tax cuts that got this economy going again. What you don't understand, Senator, because you've never been out there working in a real job, is that so many people would benefit by cutting the capital gains tax. It helps our economy. It helps our economy grow. And they're not multimillionaires. They're working men and women who benefit by this kind of a tax cut. It gets our economy growing, just as this economy has been growing for the last 6 years, where we've had unprecedented growth. We've got almost 18 million new jobs, the lowest unemployment rate in 14 years. We've got inflation down. There's a good spirit in America today. And it didn't come about as a result of Senator Kennedy's policies.
The senator mentions trickle down. Mr. Malone, do you describe yourself as a supply-sider?
I would describe myself as somebody who understands, excuse me, that you can't continue to tax and tax and tax working men and women, taking away their incentive, and then expect them to go out there and work and be productive and strive for the American dream. If that's the description of a supply-sider, then I am.
We have about 30 seconds here left. Senator
Well,
Kennedy, before
the capital gains tax is recognized as being the tax which the wealthiest individuals in this country benefit from. And as I mentioned, if you're over $200,000 income, you average a $30,000 reduction in your tax. That is where the benefit goes to. It's the top 1% taxpayers.
Tit for tat, 15 seconds.
Sure.
Mr. Malone?
Senator Kennedy has consistently been raising our taxes, $40 here, $50 here, $60 here, and now he's talking about compassion for taxpayers here. What's an appetizer to Ted Kennedy is a full meal or a week's worth of groceries to working men and women, and that's what the senator doesn't understand.
All right, we have concluded the traditional debate portion of the program, and we now go to the closing statements, and by prior agreement, we begin with Senator Kennedy.
First of all, I want to thank the channel very much for the chance of being on this program and to be able to air these views, and to also say how honored I've been to represent Massachusetts for the last 25 years. I've tried to advance your beliefs in the United States Senate and stand for the things that you stand for. I want to return to the United States Senate because we have remaining challenges. There are children to be taught, families to be housed, hungry to be fed, homeless to be looked after, discrimination to be ended, arms races to be halted, apartheid to be ended. I think the choice now is between the past and the future. Those that said you never had it so good, and those that say that you can do better. I want to return to the Senate to be able to stand for those things which you believe in. I hope you'll give me that opportunity and stand with me on Election Day. Thank you, and good night.
And closing statement now for Republican Mr. Joe Malone.
First, I'd like to thank all of those wonderful people who we have met throughout this 7-month campaign, and the kindness that you've shown to my wife, Linda, and myself has just been tremendous. There's one particular gentleman whose story has stayed with me throughout this campaign. I went back to my college reunion at Harvard the first week of June, and I met many classmates, and I met this one fellow who was catering the event that day. And we got to talking, and he told me a little bit about his life story. He said that he had arrived in this country at New York Harbor on December 21st, 1955. And he said that he couldn't even speak English well enough to buy a stamp to send word home to his mother and father to let them know that he had made it to America safely. But he went out and he learned the English language, and he got an education, and he got married, and together he and his wife went out and bought a little mom-and-pop restaurant, and they made that into a success. And then they started a little catering division. They made that into a success. And about that time in the story, I said to him, well, you have to feel pretty proud to be standing here in Harvard Yard serving 2,000 lunches. He said, I do, but I felt even more proud just a few years ago. He said, you see, I was chosen to serve the dinner in New York Harbor at Governor's Island for a dinner given by the President of the United States to commemorate the birthday of the Statue of Liberty. And I thought to myself, only in America can that happen. Only in America can an individual go out and work and risk and sacrifice to achieve the American dream. And that doesn't happen by more taxes and more regulations and more bureaucracy. It happens by individual freedom, something that is unique to America. And so I want to be a United States Senator who represents working men and women down in Washington. I want to be a United States Senator who keeps that American dream alive for millions of Americans yet to come. And with your help and your vote on November 8th, I'll do that. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I appreciate it very much.
All right. We would like to thank, of course, both of the candidates tonight, Republican Joseph Malone and Democrat Senator Ted Kennedy, for agreeing to this exchange tonight. We certainly hope that it will provide the viewers and the listeners with a possible use of the next 7 days for a guide to their voting on November 8th. And for everyone here at Channel 5 and Martha Bradley and Janet Wu, and on behalf of the Massachusetts League of Women Voters, I'm Jay Shadler, and good night.
This has been a News Center 5 Election 88 special presentation.
How can you not fall in love with something that looks so good? My Celica still gets my blood pumping.
Was at second base, and he pitched Boggs perfectly and finally got him out.
Boggs with a base hit the first time, and that one was upstairs. And that gets a reaction from this crowd, and the count goes to 1-2.
And when I say he finally got him out, Boggs fought off several pitches after 2 strikes, fouled him down the right field line, just fouled down the left field line, and Dave Stewart was able to finally pop him up.
1-2 to Boggs. Foul down. This is what Boggs is so tough. I mean, you try to get that 3rd strike by him, and he'll just keep fouling it off, until he gets what he wants.
There you saw what makes him a 360 hitter. He was completely overmatched with that fastball. I think he was looking for something else, but he was able to keep the bat level long enough just to get a piece of it.
And a piece keeps the count at 1-2. Again, straight back.
But again, you see his head stays right there, and he swings basically with his hands and arms. That was a good fork ball from Dave Stewart. He didn't quite get it as low as he would want, but Wade Boggs stayed right on it.
1-2 pitch. He got it by him. He struck him out. What a jam to get out of. The bases loaded, and he strikes out the American League batting champion. We'll return to Fenway Park after this word from our local station.
The season premieres are here, and Perfect Strangers just hit it big.
I think if you just check the numbers on our lottery ticket, you'll find that we're the lottery's newest millionaires.
Friday night's full of surprises.
Wow, you guys got eccentric fast.
And it's all new fun on Full House.
Yes, yes!
After the premiere of Perfect Strangers, Friday, October 14th.
I started a long time ago with New England Telephone. I won't tell you when. Our job has changed, but one thing hasn't.
I better phone you.
You got change? I don't need.
If you need help with a call anytime, we'll be there. We're the one for you, New England. New England Telephone. Oh.
Never in the course of human events has the world seen a light bulb offer to match this one. A Sylvania light bulb that burns 100% longer than regular soft whites, and for a limited time only, you can get it at the regular soft white price, or even lower with rebate and coupon. My friends, we are witnessing an historic occasion in the history of light bulbs.
Look for Sylvania Long Life light bulbs at these fine stores.
There's a difference when you're flying.
Where are we going today?
I'm going to Grandma's house.
With someone who shows how much they care.
I'm not going to go anywhere without you.
A smile, a tone of voice, and the willingness to try. When you love to fly, it shows.
Who's Minding the Kids? Tonight at 6.
Walt Weiss getting ready, but let's go back on that backhand stab that became a big play.
No, this is why they got Walt Weiss in the major leagues this year. They traded Alfredo Griffin to get Bobby Welsh. Look at that great play. Tony La Russa and Sandy Alderson only one.